I opened my eyes to white walls, a locked door, and the unmistakable smell of disinfectant that meant I wasn't home anymore. The last thing I remembered was signing consent forms for my gallbladder surgery 3 days ago. My daughter Rebecca holding my hand, telling me everything would be fine. Now I was wearing someone else's pajamas, in a room with padding on the walls and a camera watching me from the corner. A nurse came in, smiled that practiced smile they teach in nursing school. She asked me if I knew where I was. Of course I didn't know. She told me I was at Riverside Memory Care Facility, that I'd been admitted 2 days ago, after my surgery because of significant cognitive decline and safety concerns. I stared at her like she'd spoken another language. I owned 3 commercial properties in downtown Seattle. I'd just closed a deal worth $2 million the week before my surgery. And now someone was telling me I had dementia? I demanded to see my daughter. The nurse's smile got tighter, and she said Rebecca would visit during designated family hours, that I needed to rest. That agitation was common in early adjustment periods. She left before I could ask what the hell an adjustment period meant. I tried the door and it was locked from the outside. I wasn't a patient, I was a prisoner. When Rebecca finally came that afternoon, she wouldn't look me in the eyes. She sat in the chair farthest from my bed, and kept twisting her wedding ring around and around. I asked her what was happening and she said Dr. Morrison, the neurologist, had found evidence of advancing dementia in my pre-surgical screening, that the anesthesia had made it worse, that I'd been confused and combative after waking up. None of that was true and she knew it. But when I told her that, she just looked at the floor. Then her husband Marcus walked in, still wearing his white coat from the hospital, and suddenly everything made terrible sense. Marcus was the one who'd recommended the surgeon for my gallbladder. Marcus was the one who'd suggested that routine cognitive screening before surgery. Marcus was the physician who'd signed my admission papers to this place. He stood there with his hand on Rebecca's shoulder and explained in that calm doctor voice that I was experiencing anosognosia, the inability to recognize my own cognitive decline, that it was very common, that they were doing this because they loved me. I called him a liar. He made a note on his phone. That's when he told me he'd been granted emergency temporary guardianship due to my inability to make sound medical decisions. My power of attorney, the one I'd carefully set up with my lawyer 10 years ago, naming my son David as primary, had somehow been superseded. David was in Singapore for work, not due back for another month. Marcus had moved fast, surgical precision fast. And he'd done it while I was unconscious on an operating table. Over the next week, I pieced together exactly how deep this went. Marcus had been planning this for months, maybe longer. He'd convinced Rebecca to have me see a neurologist he knew, Drive Chen, for what he called a wellness check, back in January. I remembered that appointment, but I'd thought it was just routine blood work. Apparently Drive Chen had written notes about minor memory concerns and potential early-stage cognitive impairment. I'd never been told about any concerns. Those notes were now part of my medical record, the foundation of Marcus's case that I was incompetent. My business manager tried to visit, but was turned away because he wasn't on the approved family list. Marcus had control of that list. My lawyer called the facility and was told I wasn't accepting calls due to my condition. Marcus had control of my phone privileges too. Every attempt I made to reach the outside world hit a wall that Marcus had already built. He'd thought of everything, covered every angle. And he'd used his position as a respected physician to make sure no one questioned him. I finally got Rebecca alone in my room during one visit. I grabbed her hand and begged her to tell me why they were doing this. She started crying, but she wouldn't answer, just kept shaking her head. Then she whispered that they were in trouble. Bad trouble, that Marcus had made investments that went wrong, that they were going to lose their house. She said my assets could be liquidated to cover their debts. That Marcus said it was legal under guardianship, that it was only temporary. I asked her how much they owed. She said $400,000. I asked her if she knew what my properties were worth. She didn't answer, but I saw it in her face. She knew exactly what they were worth, and she'd made her choice. The next day I demanded to speak to someone from Adult Protective Services. A caseworker named Jennifer came. Mid-30s, tired eyes, carrying about 15 other cases I could tell. I explained everything, spoke clearly and calmly, showed her. I was perfectly coherent. She listened and took notes, but I could see. She'd already made up her mind before she walked in. She'd read Marcus's reports, seen Drive, Chen's notes, reviewed the neuropsychological testing that had supposedly been done. While I was in post-surgical recovery, everything looked legitimate on paper, and Marcus was a doctor. A professional she had no reason to doubt. Jennifer told me that many people in early dementia don't recognize their own decline. That my insistence that nothing was wrong was actually consistent with the diagnosis. She said the facility seemed clean and well run, that I was receiving good care, that families make these difficult decisions out of love. When I told her about the debt and the liquidation plan, she made a note, but said financial arrangements between guardians and wards were handled by the probate court, not her department. She left and I knew she wasn't coming back. I tried calling the police from the facility's front desk phone. When a distracted staff member left it unattended for 30 seconds, I got as far as, "I'm being held against my will," before an orderly gently took the phone from my hand. The police did send someone, a young officer who spoke to Marcus by phone, and then came to my room. He asked me a few questions, clearly trying to assess if I was lucid. I explained the whole situation, but halfway through, I saw his expression change from concerned to patient, that subtle shift. When someone decides you're not quite right in the head. He told me that civil commitment and guardianship issues weren't criminal matters. That I'd need to work with my family and doctors, that he couldn't help me. Marcus had won again. That night I tried to walk out the front door during a shift change. I made it to the parking lot before 2 orderlies caught up with me. Marcus was called, and he arrived an hour later with Dr. Chen. They both examined me, asked me why I'd tried to leave. And I told them the truth because I was being held prisoner. Dr. Chen made notes about escalating paranoia and flight risk behavior. Marcus signed new orders authorizing the staff to use sedation if I became agitated and dangerous to myself. The message was clear: fight back and they'd drug me into compliance. I spent 2 weeks in that fog of medications I didn't need, sleeping 16 hours a day. Shuffling through the hallways in socks because they'd taken my shoes. I heard other residents asking their own families why they were there. Heard staff members using the same patient voices, the same explanations. Some of those people really did have dementia. I didn't, but I was starting to understand how easy it would be to make someone believe they did. Take away their autonomy, their possessions, their contact with the outside world. Tell them over and over that they're sick, and eventually, maybe they'd start to doubt themselves. I refused to doubt. I stopped fighting. I took the medications they gave me, but hid them under my tongue and spit them out later. I attended the activities they scheduled, played bingo and did simple puzzles like a good patient. I smiled at the staff and thanked them for taking such good care of me. I told Rebecca during her weekly visits that I was starting to understand why I was here. That maybe the doctors were right. I watched her relief, the way her shoulders relaxed, the way she stopped avoiding my eyes. She thought I'd given up. So did Marcus. That's exactly what I needed them to think. There was a night nurse named Angela. who worked the 11 to 7 shift 3 times a week. She was different from the others. Actually talked to the residents like they were human beings instead of problems to manage. She'd worked in elder care for 20 years. And I could tell she'd seen everything. One night she was checking my vitals. And I asked her, very quietly, if she'd ever seen someone committed who didn't belong here. She didn't answer right away, but something changed in her face. She told me to get some sleep. 2 nights later, she came back. Angela sat on the edge of my bed and asked me questions. Real questions, testing my memory and cognition in ways the doctors hadn't. She asked about my businesses, my properties, current events, complex calculations. I answered everything perfectly. She asked about my medical history before this admission, about the surgery, about the timeline of events. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told me about another patient she'd cared for 3 years ago in California. An elderly man whose stepson had done something similar. A physician who'd used his credentials to institutionalize his stepfather and drain his accounts. That case had ended badly, with the old man dying in the facility before anyone believed him. She'd promised herself she wouldn't let it happen again. She couldn't help me officially, she said. She'd lose her license and her job. But she could get me things, my phone, for 10 minutes at a time. During her shift, access to a computer in the staff break room, copies of documents. If I could tell her exactly what I needed. She believed me, and that belief felt like oxygen after drowning for weeks. I started with my phone. Called David in Singapore at 3 in the morning my time. He was shocked, said Rebecca had told him I was doing well. Adjusting to a nice assisted living place. I explained everything in the 10 minutes Angela could give me. He said he'd get on the next flight home. Next I needed my medical records, the real ones, not the versions Marcus and Dr. Chen had created. Angela smuggled me copies of everything in my file at the facility. I read through them during the day, hiding pages in my puzzle books. The pre-surgical cognitive assessment that supposedly showed dementia. I'd never taken half those tests. The neuropsychological evaluation done while I was in recovery. I'd been unconscious from anesthesia during the timestamp on the report. Dr. Chen's notes from January mentioned memory issues I'd never reported. It was all fabricated, but it was professionally fabricated. And that's why everyone had believed it. David arrived 4 days later and immediately tried to visit me. But Marcus had him blocked at the front desk. Claimed he was causing stress to his mother and wasn't on the approved visitor list. David went straight to a lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Wu, who specialized in elder abuse cases. Within 48 hours she'd filed an emergency petition to dissolve the guardianship. And requested a full independent medical evaluation. Marcus fought back with his own lawyers. Argued that David was overseas and uninvolved in my care, that this was a vindictive family dispute. The judge ordered a hearing in 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Angela helped me build the case. She accessed the facility's security footage showing me completely lucid and coherent during times when the medical notes claimed I was confused and agitated. She found Drive Chen's schedule and proved he'd never been physically present for some of the examinations he'd documented. She discovered that Marcus had admitting privileges at 4 different memory care facilities across 3 states. Which seemed like a lot for a cardiologist. We started digging into his background. What we found was worse than I'd imagined. Marcus had done this before, not once but twice. In California, a stepfather who'd died before the case was resolved. In Arizona, an elderly aunt who'd eventually been released. But only after her estate was depleted. Both times Marcus had been working as the admitting physician. Both times there'd been questionable medical documentation. Both times guardianship had been granted to family members with debt problems. He had a system, and he'd refined it with each victim. I was supposed to be his third success. But I was going to be his downfall instead. Patricia subpoenaed records from both previous cases. She tracked down the Arizona aunt, now 87 and living with her grandson, and got a sworn statement. She hired a forensic document examiner who analyzed Drive Chen's notes and found evidence of backdating and alteration. She built a case that wasn't just about me. It was about a pattern of medical fraud and elder abuse spanning years. When we walked into that courtroom, we had everything. Marcus's lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive woman with cognitive decline, who'd manipulated a sympathetic nurse, and was being exploited by an opportunistic son who wanted control of my money. Patricia destroyed that narrative in under an hour. She presented the security footage, the falsified medical records, the expert testimony about my cognitive function, the statements from the previous victims. She showed the judge Marcus's financial records, the underwater investments, the mortgage default notices, the timeline that proved he'd started planning this. The same week his debts came due. The judge's face got harder with each piece of evidence. When Patricia presented proof that I'd never been informed of Dr. Chen's supposed concerns in January, that those notes had been created specifically to build a paper trail for future commitment, the judge actually leaned forward. When she showed that Marcus had been granted guardianship in an emergency hearing, where I had no representation and no opportunity to speak, where the only evidence was medical documents we could now prove were falsified. The judge called a recess. We reconvened an hour later. The judge dissolved the guardianship immediately, ordered my release, and referred Marcus and Dr. Chen to the medical board for investigation. She also referred the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. I walked out of that courtroom with David and Patricia. And for the first time in 2 months I could breathe without walls closing in. The criminal investigation moved fast once it started. The DA found more victims, 5 in total across 4 states. All elderly, all with assets, all with family members in Marcus's debt. Dr. Chen flipped almost immediately, testified that Marcus had paid him $50,000 to create false diagnoses. The Arizona aunt's case was reopened. The California stepfather's death was reviewed for potential involuntary manslaughter charges. Marcus tried to claim he'd been trying to help his family, that his intentions were good. But the evidence of premeditation and systematic fraud was overwhelming. He was charged with elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and practicing medicine outside his specialty with intent to deceive. Dr. Chen lost his license. Rebecca filed for divorce. Marcus's assets were frozen pending restitution to his victims. The medical board revoked his license permanently. He went to trial 8 months later and was convicted on all counts. The judge gave him 12 years in federal prison, and ordered him to pay back everything he'd stolen, plus damages. I attended every day of that trial, and I watched him realize that his carefully constructed scheme had cost him everything. His career, his freedom, his family, his future. I got my businesses back, my properties, my life. David moved back from Singapore to help me rebuild. Rebecca and I don't speak anymore. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness, and watching your daughter stand by while your freedom is stolen is one of them. Angela left the facility and now works with Patricia's law firm, helping identify potential elder abuse cases. Together we've gotten 4 more people out of similar situations. The system is still broken, still too easy for someone with credentials to exploit. But we're trying to fix it one case at a time. I'm 73 now, still running my businesses, still fighting. The white walls and locked doors visit me sometimes in dreams. But then I wake up in my own bed, in my own home, free. That's worth everything.